Honourable members, please be seated. See the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader and Minister of Transportation has risen. Seems like he might have a question. I'm not sure what it is.
No, actually, I'd like to, Mr. Speaker, I would like to request unanimous consent of the Assembly that members may be able to sit, speak, and vote from any chair within the Assembly for all of today's sitting.
I'm not sure if that was done this morning, but out of an abundance of caution, I'm more than happy to request unanimous consent. The Honourable Minister of Transportation has made a request for members to be able to sit, vote, and speak from any seat in the chamber to allow social distancing. I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed to granting unanimous consent? If so, do so now. Hearing none, unanimous consent is granted.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. Good. All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a difficult time for all Albertans, and our thoughts are with those who have lost loved ones to the COVID-19 pandemic. We should never forget that we can bring the economy back to life, but we can't bring people back to life. But we also know that many Albertans have spent their lives building businesses that are currently experiencing the greatest challenge they have ever seen. Many businesses' models simply can't be adapted to social distancing. But I've been heartened by how some of the businesses in my home community of Calgary have stepped up during this crisis. Annex Brewing Company now manufactures hand sanitizers. Calgary Co-op has given all hourly frontline employees a raise of $2.50 an hour, supporting the workers we are all relying on. Shelf Life Books, Pages Kensington, and Owl's Nest Books are all offering free book deliveries in Calgary. You can have kitchen knives biked to you by Knifeware and beer delivered by Cold Garden, Inner City, Village, and many more breweries. Rather than staging in-person performances, Verb Theatre debuted its Blue Light Festival on social media platforms. Even during COVID-19, the show must go on. These businesses know that we all have to adapt and make changes. Unfortunately, the government seems to believe it is business as usual. They pushed ahead with radical changes to the healthcare system despite pleas from physicians across the province. They rammed through a budget that took no account of the disastrous drop in oil prices. And many businesses say they are simply not being supported by the UCP government. Mr. Speaker, Alberta's businesses are doing what is necessary to get us through this crisis. When is the government going to wake up and put aside its ideological program and follow their lead? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Camrose has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Camrose includes the small town of Hardisty. But it's a small town similar to others in central Alberta. There's one thing that set Hardisty apart, the tank farm. Enbridge refers to Hardisty as the hub of the Canadian oil industry. It's hard to overstate the importance of Hardisty to Canada's energy sector. 3.5 million barrels of oil flow through Enbridge's facilities in the area each day, equivalent to 23,000 rail cars, or 80% of American oil consumption. Hardisty understands our oil and gas sector. That is why I was thrilled to receive a call from the Mayor, Doug Irving. Last night, he called to say the purchase of equity in Keystone XL is excellent news for Alberta and a great shot at bringing back prosperity to our area amidst today's doom and gloom. We know that this move is necessary. Construction must go forward with the project that will bring 830,000 barrels of oil to the Gulf. It must go forward soon in order to spur investor confidence and create jobs. If we can get this project and the TMX pipeline built, Mr. Speaker, we are well on our way to unclogging the transportation bottleneck that has hindered Alberta for so many years. This much-needed good news in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. During the campaign, the Premier was fond of telling the story of a 17-year-old boy he met in Hardisty in 2016, who asked him how long it would be before we would get rid of the NDP. On the eve of the election, the Premier told Rick Bell that should we win, he'd like to tell that boy it took 3 years, but we got her done. We don't know how long COVID-19 or the economic hardship currently facing our province will last, but I hope that soon I'll be able to tell the leadership of Hardisty that we got her done and that we have been grateful for their support all the way through.
Yeah.
The Honourable Member for Calgary North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about COVID-19 and how community response, communication, and awareness is essential in our fight to flatten the curve and stop the spread of this virus. Over the past few weeks, Albertans have been practicing physical distancing, self-isolation, and quarantine. I would like to thank everyone who has been proactive and vigilant in following these public health orders. Just a couple of weeks ago, I asked the government, what are we doing to ensure all communities receive information regarding COVID-19? As we know, some people struggle with English. It is important for their health and the safety of their families that they also get the message. I was happy to participate in a video talking about COVID-19 in my native language, and thanks to some of my colleagues who have done the same. We are working hard to make sure everyone knows just how serious this pandemic is. My community groups and volunteers, many community groups and volunteer organizations that work with some of our most vulnerable people are making sure that message gets out and people stay safe. This will not be an easy fix, but Albertans can take on this challenge. The pandemic will change things for all of us in every corner of this province, across the country and around the globe. As we navigate the new normal and unprecedented circumstances, I am inspired and encouraged by the spirit of the cooperation, resilience, and community being demonstrated by the community, by all Albertans. Our individual action will determine how many people make it through this. And we will get through this together, and one day, soon, I hope, our phone calls and FaceTimes will be our handshakes and our hugs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Mill Woods has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, when asked about the Government of Alberta's financial support program for Albertans impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, this Premier said over 40,000 people have accessed the payments. The Leader of the Official Opposition then rightly pointed out that 40,000 Albertans is roughly 1% of all of us. Countless Albertans who need help from their provincial government are struggling with a fiscal support program that seems almost intentionally set up to frustrate their efforts. All of our offices continue to hear from a great many Albertans who need immediate financial relief and who are frustrated by a website that continues to have technical difficulties, long digital queues, and various strange hurdles that can seem impossible to clear right now. Yesterday, during the special debate on COVID-19, the Finance Minister also made it quite clear that Alberta's Emergency Isolation Support Program is time-bombed. The website to apply will likely disappear as soon as the federal support programs come online, which we are expecting to happen on April 6th. This is devastating news to many Albertans who are still struggling to get through the myriad of challenges this program has thrown at them. It is starting to feel like this government is more interested in limiting their budget for this program rather than providing financial supports to every Albertan that need it right now. It's hard to believe that a province that once sent $400 checks to every man, woman, and child is now struggling to provide funds to the people who need it. 1% of Albertans have managed to access this, but that is not a job well done. It's time for the government to step forward with a more streamlined approach to providing Albertans direct financial supports during the crisis, as Albertans will likely be asked to continue staying home wherever possible for several more weeks and maybe even more months yet. It's time for this government to revise and expand the Emergency Isolation Support Program to support those we've identified that are falling through the cracks, not end it. Albertans need direct financial support from this government right now to put food on their table, Mr. Speaker.
Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 epidemic is causing vast amounts of concern and damage around the globe right now. Our province is currently locked in a battle with this virus, and we are doing everything in our power to stem its spread. Preventing the virus from spreading to our vulnerable people, our elders, those with underlying conditions, and within our communities should be our #1 priority right now as a society. The Government of Alberta has laid out rules to follow to help stop the virus from spreading. If you have traveled outside the country, you must self-quarantine for 14 days and an additional 10 days upon development of any symptoms. If you develop symptoms and you have not been traveling internationally, you must self-isolate for 10 days at a minimum. There are restrictions in place for mass gatherings, calling for the immediate cancellation of all events with greater than 15 people. When out in public, you should always maintain a 2-meter distance between you and any other people, as well as practice good general hygiene, such as frequent hand washing, sanitization of surfaces, and avoid touching your face. I implore all of those people who are isolating to actually isolate. Staying home and being off work does not mean taking your family to Jasper for the weekend. It does not mean going out unnecessarily. If we do all of these things, we have the greatest chance of slowing and maybe even stopping the spread of this virus. Staying home and being safe is a small price to pay for helping to slow this pandemic, and it's the fastest way to get things back to normal. You can keep up to date from home on all the COVID-19 information at www.alberta.ca/COVID-19. Finally, I would like to thank all those who are still working. Farmers, essential service, and healthcare workers are putting themselves at risk to ensure our province can function semi-normally during this time. These workers need to be recognized and commended for their efforts in the face of this pandemic. I sincerely say thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was a therapist, I worked with many people who failed to be able to respond to the challenges of life with a sense of their own power to deal with barriers and challenges. Instead, they would sit back and wonder why others were not taking care of them. They would wait for those with initiative and a positive sense of self to take the reins and steer them clear of the problems at hand. And this is exactly what I have witnessed by this government. Last night, I had the opportunity to question the Minister of Seniors and Housing. While she expressed concern for seniors, she was completely unable to identify one thing that her ministry had done for seniors. Instead, she stated that they had been busy asking the CEOs of various organizations what they had been doing to prepare, providing no actual help from the ministry. Further, when asked about the provision of PPEs, the minister said that private companies had been asked to help out and were doing so. Nothing from the ministry except passiveness. Then I had the chance to question the Minister of Indigenous Relations. When he spoke about the assistance to First Nations, he spoke about money going to every nation. But on questioning, it was clear that the money was coming from the federal government. What, I asked, did the minister do to help First Nations? The answer, he was on the phone with the federal minister asking for help, waiting for the help to come from someone other than himself. On the weekend, the Ministry of Education laid off over 20,000 teachers' aides and other school support staff. You'll notice that I said that they were laid off by the ministry and not the minister, who in true fashion failed to attend the announcement. When questioned about this move, it was clear that the federal government saw an opportunity to transfer responsibility for these public servants to the federal EI program rather than taking care of their own. We live in the wealthiest province in Canada, and yet we have been the least responsive to the needs of our citizens. Mr. Premier, it is time to stop being a victim of circumstances and show some leadership that does not count on the opposition forcing your hand or the federal government bailing you out.
The Honourable Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, we are continuing to see the extent of the heartbreak that the novel coronavirus can bring to our communities. The news of multiple deaths as a result of this disease, including at several continuing care centers, highlights the seriousness of COVID-19. And I want to share my deepest condolences to all the families who have lost loved ones to this terrible pandemic. Now more than ever, Albertans need to support one another. These are emotionally challenging times, and they affect every one of us. Between fears of our loved ones' health, widespread layoffs, and general uncertainty about what the future brings, it can be hard to find positivity these days. However, Albertans have a long and storied history of supporting their communities, and especially at times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has proved to be no different. Across the province, stories have emerged of communities finding new ways to come together while following physical distancing rules. There are countless stories coming out of our communities about how Albertans are supporting each other in this difficult and emotional time. The Alberta Cares hashtag, started by Dr. Dina Henshaw, to put forth a spotlight on the kindness that Albertans are showing to each other. This hashtag has shown just some of the many generous ways that our communities are showing each other that they care. The COVID-19 pandemic is frightening, and it must be taken seriously. But we are a strong and resilient province, and we are going to get through this together. To those who are feeling helpless in their situation, please reach out to friends and neighbors. Even the smallest act of saying hello can raise someone's spirits. And together we can support one another in the difficult days ahead and get through this. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Falconridge has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Years of economic stagnation have taken a toll on many of Alberta's households. Now the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and shocking drop in the price of oil as a result of Russia price war have pushed our province's economy into the crisis. Now more than ever, our province needs some good news. That's why Monday's announcement that the Keystone XL Pipeline will finally be started was so welcomed. In this time of unprecedented adversity and economic crisis, this significant project is a bold move to retake control of our province's economy. The Keystone XL Pipeline is moving forward with a $1.5 billion government investment to accelerate the construction of the project. As of yesterday, this project is hiring and getting shovels in the ground. In a time when economic stimulus is needed, more than ever, our government is pushing forward a project that will support this province's energy sector when support is needed the most. We cannot wait until the end of this pandemic to think of our province's economic recovery, with hundreds of thousands across the province potentially out of work. Every day matters. Our government has always been focused on getting Albertans back to work and helping our province's economy get back on its feet after several challenging years. The Keystone XL Pipeline is expected to create 7,000 jobs during construction and will generate estimated $30 billion in tax and royalty revenues for our future generations. This project is an important step as we look ahead to economic recovery and build confidence in our economy. There is no denying that the days to come will be difficult for our province, but I want Albertans to know that our government is looking at every option.
The honourable member for Livingston-Macleod.
Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic is causing many Albertans to appreciate the hard work that often goes unnoticed, but keeps our society moving. In the early days of the pandemic, many Albertans were shocked to see the empty shelves at the grocery stores. Before the pandemic, many of us had overlooked the critical work that grocery store clerks, long-haul truckers, and many other roles that help keep our society going. Within days of the original shock of demand, most of our store shelves went back to normal. And this isn't by accident. It is a credit to the thousands of hardworking men and women who are maintaining the supply chain during this period of unprecedented crisis. If you drive down the QE2 or Highway 3 in my riding of Livingston-Macleod, these days you won't see the typical commuter traffic. Many people are following the public health advice to stay home to prevent the spread of COVID-19. However, the highway is filled with transport trucks working to haul supplies that we rely on to their destinations. Food, fuel, medicine, personal protective equipment, none of it would be reaching its destination without truck drivers working around the clock to transport the essentials that we all need for our daily lives. In this period of a pandemic and economic crisis, something as simple as picking up your favorite brand of cookies or having milk available at the store for when we run out at home is a boost to morale. This option is something that we often take for granted, but it would not be possible without the people working hard to maintain our supply chain. So, to the unsung heroes of this pandemic, thank you for keeping us supplied and ensuring that we can tackle the tough road ahead together. We are so truly grateful. Thank you.
Honourable members, we are at oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's Official Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all understand the strategic value of the Keystone XL Pipeline to our energy industry. We need more takeaway capacity, and we need it at the price that only pipelines can offer. However, $7.5 billion is a considerable investment at a time when the risk is unprecedented. Indeed, after the investment was announced, TC's own credit rating went down. So can the Premier advise this House how many independent risk assessments this government has received, and more importantly, will he make them public to Albertans, the ones who are making this investment?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was proud on behalf of the Government of Alberta to announce an historic investment to get a major pipeline built, the Keystone XL Pipeline, after 10 years of delays, with an historic investment that saw construction begin yesterday and commissioning of this pipeline in June of 2023 that will move 830,000 barrels of Alberta oil to the U.S. Gulf Complex. That will generate, we estimate, $30 billion of incremental revenues. We gave a briefing to the opposition. We're happy to share certain details, but some of it is subject to commercial.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That was starting to be the answer. But let me just say, we support this project, but we know people need details. Plus, there are other factors that complicate it. Unlike the TMX expansion, which exists inside a regulatory environment entirely under the federal government's control, Keystone operates in multiple jurisdictions. So can the Premier please explain to the House what contractual structures, guarantees, or other agreements are in place to mitigate the risk within state and international jurisdictions in which we have neither regulatory nor legal agency?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was saying that there are elements of the agreement that are commercially sensitive and that are therefore to which we are legally bound to maintain confidence. However, I can assure Albertans that we worked with great diligence over the past many months with world-class external financial advisors to structure an investment that protects Alberta taxpayers. We are at the top of the capital stack with the $1.5 billion Canadian equity investment that protects Alberta taxpayers. Any construction cost overruns are the responsibility of TC Energy, and I'm happy to answer further.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we can't just take the Premier at his word. At a time when students, healthcare workers, patients, seniors, entrepreneurs, you name it, are all being told to make do with less because the cupboards are bare, we owe it to all of them to show our homework when making an investment with such risk. Given we are now funding and backstopping over half the cost of this project, will the Premier release all the detailed risk and benefit analyses, and will he assure us that the people of Alberta will have equitable representation on the board of TC Energy?
The Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I have to remind the Leader of the Opposition that she and her government provided absolutely zero information to Albertans on their pointless crude by rail deal, which risked $4 billion in order to move maximum 120,000 barrels a day over 2 years. Mr. Speaker, this is a $1.5 billion equity investment, a preferred investment where we'll sell the shares at a profit that will help us to move 830,000 barrels a day for decades to come, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the Official Opposition for her second set of questions.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will have more to say about the inaccuracies included in that answer, but moving on, we currently have 41 cases of COVID-19 in continuing care facilities. A majority of those cases have been at Mackenzie Town Continuing Care. 4 people have died at the centre, and once again, we offer our condolences to their families. We also know that 23 members there, staff members, have tested positive. This is not the only long-term care centre where cases have spread, putting staff and residents at risk. Will the Premier do what has been done in other places and ban employees from working at more than one facility?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Emergency Management Committee of Cabinet received recommendations from the Chief Medical Officer of Health in that respect, and an announcement will be made at 3:30 today about further restrictions on the operation of continuing care facilities to ensure that everything that is possible is being done to protect residents who are uniquely vulnerable in those situations.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
I might suggest we could make the announcement here since we're in question period, but working in long-term care is not easy. These staff care deeply about their residents. That's why they are working so hard right now to make sure people still have baths, meals, and some level of routine and comfort. Yeah. They also need to be protected and to feel supported to stay home. So should the government move forward to ban them working in more than one place, and given that they need that for a full income, will the government commit to compensating these staff should their ability to work in more than one site be limited?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Chief Medical Officer of Health and AHS are consulting with the Alberta Continuing Care Association and the individual seniors lodges and facilities to address labour market concerns, because if orders are given that inhibit their workforce, we are concerned that it may inhibit their ability to care for the seniors, to provide food and medical attention. And so we're trying to work out sensible protocols to ensure continued access to labour under restricted public health orders for continuing care facilities.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we get that issue, but the answer is just to hire more people. Now, in Vancouver, there were 9 deaths at a single facility, and they also found the virus had spread to 3 other homes in the area. And there, the city's health authority immediately prohibited staff from working at more than one facility. This is because they go between locations and enhance the transmission. Now, in addition, we heard yesterday that staff are only getting tested when they become symptomatic. Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, why are we not testing all long-term care staff all the time, regularly, with or without symptoms, in order to keep our loved ones safe?
Hey, hey. The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government is following the scrupulous advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health with respect to prioritizing access to testing. I'm pleased to report that Alberta has by far the highest per capita incidence of COVID-19 testing in North America and one of the highest levels in the world. We have the Chief Medical Officer has prioritized continuing care facilities and seniors' residences. There is daily temperature testing, I understand, of all staff, if they are asymptomatic, and other protocols that have been put in place.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta's Chief Medical Officer said yesterday that the health and safety of those living in seniors' facilities is currently her greatest concern. Yet, having spoken to several staff in seniors' facilities, they report being dangerously low on protective equipment and cleaning supplies. Some say they will run out this week. When will the Premier make seniors' lodges a priority and ensure they have the supplies they need?
The Honourable, the Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. It's a very important question, so we're going to continue to make sure we support and make sure that our frontline medical officers that's safe and healthy to serve our senior. And definitely, as I mentioned last night again, that we have played very carefully that since the day one, our caucus at the meeting addressed this issue. And in fact, that we have to post as a link that asks them that all the suppliers and provide all this as PPE and to our government.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it was another non-answer from the Minister. The lack of supplies is a serious factor, since without them, the spread of COVID-19 will dramatically increase. Seniors' lodges are also dealing with tremendous challenges regarding staffing. We have learned that 30 to 50% of staff are no longer coming to work due to self-isolation, childcare issues, being symptomatic, or fear of COVID-19. What province-wide staffing strategy does the Premier have for Alberta's lodges?
The Honourable, the Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speakers. And as I mentioned that we have a daily call if all the leader of the senior nonprofit organization who serve senior, we watch very closely and what are the issue. And then in fact that my staff that have extended the invitation to the honorable member to discuss all the issue and the suggestions that they can provide it and work together. However, I'm still waiting for her reply.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously we know what the issues are, so I don't know why the phone calls are coming to find out what they are. We know very clearly what they are. I want to express my condolences to the families of those who have lost loved ones at the Mackenzie Town Continuing Care Centre. Other families with loved ones there say they're in a, quote, living nightmare, and are receiving very little communication with their families or staff at the centre. Other jurisdictions have gone to great lengths to keep loved ones connected in these centres. Premier, this situation must be fixed today. How do you plan to do it?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing.
As I mentioned, that is my condolences to all the friends and families who lost their loved ones in the Mackenzie the senior lodge, and my condolences. And then in fact that we are working closely with my colleague, the Minister of Health, that we are doing a fantastic job. Thank you for your team and manage this COVID-19, particularly in the long-term care center. We are continuously to keep in contact with the center and see any extra support that we can provide to them. As a matter of fact, we will continue to work on that.
The honourable member for St. Albert has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Community and Social Services said every homeless shelter is in compliance with AHS guidelines for stopping the spread of COVID-19. However, she pointed to no real evidence that hotels and motels would not be more suitable than crowded convention centres in Edmonton and Calgary. By blocking Calgary's plan to use hotel rooms to decrease crowding at shelters, this minister is putting the whole community at risk. Minister, cities like Toronto and Vancouver are finding solutions. Why can't we?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I just read an article this morning about how a hotel in Toronto has been found not to be suitable because they didn't have the sufficient retrofits required. And in terms of providing evidence or data, I would invite anybody on that side of the House to join me tomorrow evening on a visit to the isolation site in Calgary to actually understand what the retrofits do look like. We had to move very quickly to comply with social distancing guidelines, and hotels were not the solution because they take time to get ready.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brian Wolfe, who's been homeless for about a year, had this to say about Edmonton's Expo Centre, and I quote, "The distance between the beds isn't the only thing. There's other issues like illnesses, fights, and theft. I don't feel safe." Nick Falvo has done frontline work in this area for a decade. He says people sleeping in common areas and sharing bathrooms increases the risk. This isn't about achieving a minimum standard. This is about supporting every single Albertan, all of them. To the Minister, if those most at risk don't feel safe, can you say that you're doing your job?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, there's nothing ideal in this situation. Homeless shelters are never the solution. Housing is a solution. But we're in a pandemic response. We have to move quickly. We have to ensure that we're complying with social distancing guidelines. And we worked with the City of Edmonton to come up with this solution. And we are doing our level best in this situation to provide as safe of an environment as we possibly can.
Here for St. Albert.
Your level best isn't good enough. Calgary Mayor Nenshi told the Herald, and I quote, "This is not the solution I would have chosen. I think there are probably ways that would be more effective in slowing the transmission of the virus." This government is refusing to listen to municipalities who are in the best position to stop the spread. This is not dignified. It is not proper social distancing, and it is increasing the risk. Minister, please listen to homeless Albertans, the experts in vulnerable supports, the Mayor of Calgary, and reverse this irresponsible decision.
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I was texting with the Mayor of Calgary today. He's very well aware of the issues with the hotels. And in fact, when the city was talking to the Hotel Association, one of the hotels backed out once they realized what the retrofits were required. And we have been talking to the experts. We've been talking to Homeward Trust, to the Calgary Homeless Foundation, and they are working with us to put together these interim solutions to make sure that we are keeping the homeless population as safe as we can and are complying with Alberta Health Services.
Here, here. The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans stay up to date through social media, but we know seniors are less likely to access information in this way. As we continue to encourage best practices to stop the spread of COVID-19, we need to ensure that seniors have the best information to limit their outings. For example, it's been great to see many grocery store chains offering seniors-only hours to help them shop safely. To the Minister of Seniors and Housing, what is the ministry doing to ensure seniors have access to the latest information, including the safest shopping options?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the members for her questions. It's a very important questions, Mr. Speaker. I have made calls to the major grocery store chains that asking them to implement that special hours for the seniors. Most of the waiters were very happy to do so. I've also made a call thinking those grocery stores that the business who have already took on initiative very quickly for those seniors who cannot do the grocery shop in person. We are working with our senior serving organization and we'll serve them.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for her answer. Given that the senior population is the most at risk of suffering fatalities if they contract COVID-19, and they are advised to stay at home and out of the public as much as possible to limit their risk of exposure to this virus, and further given that some seniors do not have access to internet and technology, to the same Minister, could you please advise this House what you are doing to ensure seniors are aware of their options to secure essentials such as groceries and prescriptions, as well as other possible needs like meal delivery?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question again. And I would like to thank all the dedicated community workers and volunteers who are helping to keep our seniors safe during this difficult time. We are working nonstop with our partners in the nonprofit sector to help seniors stay connected and ensure that they are receiving the supplies that they require. We are working with the community social service to ensure funding is flowing to those organizations that are support the needs of our senior.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the Minister. Given that seniors may require additional supports, including increased medical attention, daily living assistance, and health services, such as regular blood work or pharmacy visits, and given that seniors have been advised to stay home as much as possible for their safety and to help stop the spread of COVID-19, and further, that some seniors have no family to rely upon at this time to ensure their ability to access these services, could the Minister of Health please explain how seniors can receive the help they need to safely maintain their access to care and quality of life during this pandemic?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seniors, as we know, are the highest risk from COVID, along with people of all ages who have chronic conditions or suppressed immune systems. That means that seniors who are in continuing care are under extra restrictions, and I know it's stressful for them and their families. Seniors could call or should call 211 for information on services that are available to them. And for seniors, housing providers, Alberta Seniors and my ministry as well have worked together to host a telephone town hall later today with the Chief Medical Officer of Health.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans have a right to know if the air they breathe, the ground they grow their food on, and their waterways are contaminated. That's why it was shocking to see that the Minister of the Environment this week suspended environmental reporting that was previously required under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, the Water Act, and the Public Lands Act. Can the Minister explain why he is using a pandemic to suspend environmental monitoring?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member knows, we are not suspending environmental monitoring. In fact, environmental monitoring must continue. And we have made no changes to drinking water or to wastewater at all. What we have made is some changes to when reports have to come into the government to help industry who are dealing with self-isolation amongst their staff to be able to have more time to provide these comprehensive documents to the Alberta government, Mr. Speaker. But to be very, very clear, all requirements to monitor and to ultimately report remain intact.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbart.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that the Minister just said that the reporting requirements remain intact, but his ministerial order says exactly the opposite, and given that as recently as 2 days ago, a company was facing charges under the Water Act for failing to monitor its water use, using water without approval, and failing to properly report its water use to the Alberta Energy Regulator, and given that it's obvious to everyone that without a requirement to report, there will be no way to hold people accountable under the law, will the Minister explain how lawbreakers will be held to account under the new system of less accountability, less transparency, and less reporting?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, the answer is simple. There is no new system. All reporting requirements may remain the same, both daily, monthly, quarterly, depending on what is happening within the system. Nothing has changed at all for drinking water and or wastewater, Mr. Speaker. This is purely about the filing of paperwork, Mr. Speaker. Reporting of leaks or things that happen in the environment must happen immediately as per all requirements. All investigations would continue within our department and would happen if there was some sort of a leak that takes place, as well as I'm happy to report, Mr. Speaker, the entire emergency response apparatus of Alberta Environment is fully able to operate in the pandemic.
The Honourable Member.
Well, given that all of those systems only kick into action when polluters have reported to the department that something has happened, and given that Tuesday environmental approvals were based on strict reporting requirements, and given that these requirements included monthly reporting on things like flow rates for sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter, and given that the government hasn't made clear that these requirements will be impacted by these changes, will the Minister clarify whether requirements to report will remain despite his changes, or will this be another level of accountability and environmental protection undone by this Minister and this government?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP spent so much time making things up. I can't be any more clear than this, Mr. Speaker. All reporting requirements remain the same. If there is something that is wrong that would require reporting on an emergency basis, referring to what the member is referring to, that must take place. Earlier today, the Honourable Member was telling the media that this changes how we report drinking water, Mr. Speaker, and in fact, the order specifically says it has nothing to do with drinking water or wastewater. It is about paperwork and helping companies comply with very comprehensive reporting as they go through the pandemic.
Order. I think you've had your opportunity to speak. The Minister's had his. And now it's the Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora's opportunity.
Mr. Speaker, last night while we discussed the Education Minister's response to the pandemic, the Minister said too much funding was given to children with special needs through program unit funding, and that boards should use some of that money to prevent firing other support staff. She actually said that, Mr. Speaker, that the funding designated for young children with special needs should be cut to cover up for her mistake. Does the Minister actually believe that it's fair to cut funding for students with special needs because she chose to lay off more than 20,000 school staff?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, what I actually said last night is that PUF funding will continue to be provided to all students. There were a number of boards that approached me with the fact that they weren't able to spend all their PUF funding, and we absolutely gave them the flexibility to use it with all students. Beyond that, I'm happy to report that today I was able to attend a facilitated hour-long town hall with the Alberta School Councils Association with over 1,000 parents who asked me questions, very hard questions, but we had a great dialogue.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora has a question.
Oh, given that I know, and I'll have more to say about that later, given that the minister's repeated claims that school boards and superintendents told her to lay off more than 20,000 Albertans, but given that during the debate last night, the minister was unable to name a single school board, administrator, or superintendent who wanted these cuts. Normally, the minister is flanked by validators if they're actually calling for what she's doing. I can name many that are deeply opposed to what the minister has done. Will the education minister finally stand up and tell Albertans specifically then which school boards, superintendents, or administrators asked for these cuts, or will she admit that she made it up?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said and indicated last evening, I had a number of school divisions, and as the honourable member knows, that when school divisions or others approach you to speak in confidence, that you keep a confidence. And therefore, I will continue on to say that we have been very fortunate to have conversations and have a good dialogue with all of my education partners. They understand that this is unprecedented times. I've had numerous letters and emails of support since then, and we'll continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Given that sounds like the minister's trying to use them as a scapegoat, given that the same boards are showing exceptional courage, many boards are showing exceptional courage, Prairie Rose, Medicine Hat, and now Red Deer Public are saying that they will not do the UCP government's dirty work, and given that these boards know more than the minister does about how critical these employees are to student learning, these boards are putting kids before cuts. Will the minister actually listen to these boards that are publicly speaking up, and reverse her terrible cuts?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to say that at 11:45 this morning, I had a conversation with the senior executive of Red Deer Public, as well as the board chair, and they stressed their support of our leadership and the fact that we were able to give them the flexibility that they needed to meet the demands of their students. It was a great conversation, and I appreciated their verbal support in amongst a letter that they also sent as well. I can also say that in these unprecedented times, we all have to dig deep and do what we can for our students, and I'm so proud of the people that are.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore.
Mr. Speaker, in a period of pandemic, the need for information and data is particularly important. Our province has been leading in the COVID-19 testing. We have one of the highest rates of testing per capita in the world. This is a valuable distinction. The more that we test, the better that we can plan our province's response to COVID-19. When my constituents heard about a backlog in our province's testing, they brought their concerns to me. To the Minister of Health, how is our province increasing COVID-19 testing capacity?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta continues to test at some of the highest rates in the world. Our supply of reagents ran low over the weekend and temporarily slowed down our testing. On Monday, a new shipment of reagent arrived, and we're now back at full capacity, I'm happy to say. In addition, Albertans will soon have faster, more convenient access to testing through a new partnership between AHS as well as Spartan Bioscience. It's another example of the leadership and the innovation here in Alberta, and it's a credit to our health system.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that adherence to public health orders, including isolation orders and physical distancing measures, is essential to preventing the spread of COVID-19, and given that our government is taking seriously the need to enforce public health orders for the safety of our most vulnerable communities and all Albertans, again to the Minister of Health, how will Bill 10 help prevent the spread of COVID-19 throughout our province?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Well, Bill 10 is going to be very important for us, Mr. Speaker, as well as the previous ministerial orders that were issued for us to be able to ensure that the tools for our public health inspectors, as well as added resources allowing community peace officers and police officers to help with the enforcement of the public health orders, and as well as adding some other tools to their toolbox, such as administrative monetary penalties for violations and increasing fines for the courts to be able to, if somebody is very significantly contravening the act or an order.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the COVID-19 outbreak has affected every Albertan, and given that many people are suffering due to isolation, uncertainty, and significant changes to their daily lives, and given that public health officials have continued to highlight the importance of Albertans' mental health during COVID-19's pandemic, to the same minister,
what resources are available to Albertans to support their mental health during this incredibly difficult time?
The Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mental health is a critical piece of the overall response to COVID-19. If you need help, please call the mental health line at 1-877-303-2642, day or night, 7 days a week. There's also the addiction helpline at 1-866-332-2322. Albertans can also visit the Alberta Health website for more resources, including other helplines and how to access treatment for mental health and addiction. And I want to thank our community partners who are stepping up for innovative solutions.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier told the House that AHS has 1,300 acute beds currently available for COVID patients, and that number will rise to 2,250 by April 22nd. On Monday, the BC Health Minister announced they have 4,233 acute beds available for COVID patients. We don't currently have even a third of the acute care bed capacity of BC, and we might get to half by the end of the month. How does the government explain how we have freed up so much less acute care capacity than our neighbouring province, which only has about 16% more population?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I can't speak to BC's numbers, but I can say this. The Honourable Member is ignoring as well that the current number of ICU beds that we have in ICU spaces is right now 295, and by April 22nd, I think we're going to get that up to over 1,290-something ICU spaces for patients with COVID. That's going to be very specifically for those patients who are suffering from COVID-19, as well as the other 2,250 that we are going to be blocking, as well as other beds that we're going to be finding in the weeks to come.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that Alberta's COVID bed capacity at present is considerably smaller than BC's, and given that that capacity is also being increased more slowly, is this slow response a deliberate choice by government based on modelling, just to understand the decision? And how quickly could it be accelerated if we should see the spread of COVID moving faster than the government may be anticipating?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I can't speak to BC or BC's numbers. I can say this. We have over 850 sites throughout and facilities throughout the province. That includes our 100 hospitals. That means that we have almost 8,500 beds throughout the province of Alberta. Significantly more than what BC has. I think they have only 5,000 in their entire province. Now, out of those 8,483 beds that we have here in Alberta, right now we have specifically blocked 1,300 as of today, and getting it up to 1,500 by the end of the week, and continue to add and build new beds and new resources for throughout AHS.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec are all developing plans for field hospitals in large public buildings, and given that Alberta has been slower than BC to ramp up its COVID bed capacity, does the government have any plans to convert convention centres, arenas, other large venues into field hospitals? And if so, how advanced are those plans, and what venues are being considered for use?
The Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do have contingency plans. We are, through our modelling, we do have a probable scenario. I think, we have the resources already to date for the probable scenario, even for the elevated scenario. For an extreme scenario, if we do see something as what's being seen in Spain or Italy, which frankly I don't see as happening considering what our testing is showing right now in Alberta. But if that were the case, we have been working with a local company here in Alberta to be able to build field hospitals throughout the province.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Decor has risen.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans and their businesses are going through a very tough time right now. Many have lost their jobs, had to reduce working hours for staff, or had to stay home or work to shut down their business just to self-isolate. They need help, and they need it fast. What is the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction doing to cut red tape so Albertans and their businesses can get access to the benefits as quickly as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can say on behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Infrastructure, that the or the ministry is under instructions to make things move as fast as they can by whatever means they can that is reasonable. It's not the detail that perhaps that the honourable member wants, but I want the House to know and all Albertans to know that our government will clear obstacles and cut to the chase when that becomes necessary.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given it's now April and that many Albertans are in desperate need of financial support to put food on the table, and given the government's website to apply for the isolation benefit has been down repeatedly, with as many as 30,000 people waiting in the online queue to apply for benefits, can the minister explain why there is so much red tape preventing Albertans from getting the support they need?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We appreciate the patience of Albertans during this unprecedented health crisis, and we continue to work with Service Alberta to address these issues. And we are committed to helping families through these challenging times. Now, the federal government initially emphasized that its program would be up and running by April 1st. We've learned now that they will not be up and running until next week. And because of this, we are committed to keep Alberta's emergency isolation support program open for longer than anticipated, which will result in us exceeding the initial cost of the program, which was pegged at $50 million. Now, this number is obviously evolving as we process more applications.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that the online application forces Albertans to create a My Alberta Digital ID account, and given that many Albertans are complaining about technical issues in creating that account, and given that this seems like an unnecessary step that is delaying much-needed financial support for Albertans, will the government cut this red tape out of the application process, or is the real problem the fact that this government cut too many IT staff to solve this problem?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As indicated in debate last night, we announced this program 2 weeks ago. Last week, we opened up the program for Albertans to apply, and we received unprecedented number of applications. We were working very hard with Service Alberta to use this platform. And initially, this platform, Mr. Speaker, was for the fire outbreak and to provide benefits to those who are impacted by that, but 5,000. And we have processed over 60,000 applications, and we continue to do so to help Albertans.
The honourable member for Peace River has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta's energy sector has given immensely to the prosperity of this province, and as well the entire prosperity of our Canadian economy. Understanding that the time to repay this debt is now, and this sector needs our help more than ever. Oil and gas properties across Alberta sit abandoned. Orphan wells sit stagnant. And our government recognizes the importance of completing the life cycle of oil and gas sites. Can the Minister of Energy please elaborate for this House why it is so important for our province to invest in the orphan well cleanup?
Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for your question. This has been a problem that's been in the works for decades in this province, as previous governments have not set rules to adequately address the decommissioning of wells at the end of their life. Now, with an industry that has been in financial peril for the last 4 years, and with an onslaught of additional expected bankruptcies, we have literally thousands of orphan wells that we will have to deal with. Mr. Speaker, our government has invested $100 million additional into the Orphan Well Association to help fulfill these cleanups.
The honourable member for Peace River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you also to the Minister for her response. Given that the Orphan Well Association coordinates so much important work and oversight across the entire province on this issue, and given that orphan well cleanup creates important jobs in the energy sector, but more importantly, helps to retain the skilled labour force, which will be critical to the future of Alberta's energy sector. Again, to the Minister of Energy, how will increasing the capability of Orphan Well Association support our province's economic recovery after this economic crisis?
The Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you to the member for your question. Increasing the authority of the Orphan Well Association will help deal with the thousands of wells that are already in existence, orphan wells that are already in existence, and will address additional wells that we feel will fall into the Orphan Well Association. By enhancing the authority of the Orphan Well Association, we will enable that organization to better be able to deal with the inventory it has and will get, to better be able to clean it up and to operate the assets that still have a useful production life.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Minister. Given that economic recovery and job creation will be critical once the pandemic ends, and that many Albertans are not only concerned for their health, but also deeply concerned for the financial well-being of their family and of this province, and given that our government has extended a $100 million loan to the Orphan Well Association to create jobs, but then again also to make sure that we complete the life cycle of thousands of wells, to the Minister of Energy, what enhanced role for the Orphan Well Association is being proposed in Bill 12?
The Minister.
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Speaker. Bill 12 gives the Orphan Well Association the ability to better manage assets that are left behind for companies that are going bankrupt or are insolvent. The legislation will clarify the authority of the Orphan Well Association so that they are able to make agreements in the operation of those sites. They'll be able to make agreements with producers to help close sites, things like the area-based closure. They'll ensure that oil and gas resources that are left behind by insolvent and bankrupt companies can continue to operate if they are not at the end of their production life.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall is rising with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the government announced that they are going to be temporarily reducing the budget of their failed war room. While this was a start, the war room has been an international embarrassment for our province, and it is still getting some funding, while more than 20,000 school staff that were actually helping kids have been fired. But can the Minister of Energy please explain why the government is wasting a single dollar more on the war room? Why don't she put this terrible creation out of its misery?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Energy Centre is reducing its operational budget by 90%, from $30 million to $2.84 million annualized over a 12-month period. Mr. Speaker, we've reduced its budget to bare-bones operations during the COVID pandemic.
Member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that the government has failed to properly support all Albertans who are facing the fallout from this pandemic, and given that many who have lost their job can't even access emergency funding support they were promised, but given a failed UCP candidate remains in his post at the head of the bogus war room, can the Minister of Energy explain why the government is prioritizing a failed UCP candidate's vanity project over supporting struggling Albertans?
Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, we have reduced the budget of the Canadian Energy Centre down to bare bones, to mere operational things, to pay for things like administration, office infrastructure, administrative support staff, and to fulfill a basic research function. Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, we have reduced its budget significantly. We will resume its budget after we get through this because it maintains an important function in our energy literacy.
The Honourable Member.
That reduction is not enough. It needs to be reduced to zero. Given that war room isn't even producing content from what I can tell, and given that there is so little transparency when it comes to the war room, people are left to wonder just what Tom Olson and his crew do all day. To the Minister, when regular proceedings in the House resume, will you commit to have Tom Olson come before a legislative committee to explain just what he does all day, if not what you are hiding?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the course of the COVID pandemic, the Canadian Energy Centre is still focusing on some basic research functions. And in fact, they just published a couple of very, very interesting pieces on that will help us as we come out of this crisis, this financial crisis, into recovery. Things talking about the importance of the Canadian energy industry to our economy and the importance of it to a North American-wide economy. Mr. Speaker, these functions are needed and they need to be fulfilled somewhere. We will continue and look forward to the Energy Centre resuming.
Honourable member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard in our technical briefings that the 25 largest government infrastructure projects have been impacted by COVID-19. In particular, there have been workforce issues with Albertans needing to self-isolate and practice social distancing. The government currently contracts with the private sector to clear our highways of snow. To the Minister of Transportation, can you assure the House that you have enough people power to 100% clear the highways if we get a major snowstorm in the coming days or weeks? Is the full workforce in place, or are you expecting any challenges?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can report to the House that we experience challenges at the very best of times, and because Alberta has a winter climate, and when it snows, that's part of the reason why we set priorities where the most busiest routes get cleaned first, and then the second most busiest, and from there until they all get done. And that hasn't changed, Mr. Speaker. We still have our contractors are still expected to be staffed up, have equipment ready, and do the full job every single time. I've gotten no indication thus far that anything other than that will occur.
The Honourable member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Given we have also heard that virtually all of the major government construction projects are plagued with problems and delays because of the supply chain issues, given that the projects are suffering because businesses can't get the necessary inputs when they need them, given that we need a consistent supply chain to maintain our highways and make sure that these critical corridors stay open and safe, can the Minister of Transportation assure the House that in every corner of our province, our highway maintenance contractors have sufficient supplies to get through to the end of the winter season and keep our highways fully open? Lives might well depend on it.
The Minister of Transportation.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the honourable member that on supplies like, for example, I think he might be referring to things like salt and sand and other things that go on the roads. Our contractors, generally speaking, put them up before winter starts and have them in storage. So I expect that would have been what happened, and I've heard no indication that we won't have enough supplies, and our contractors under contract are expected every single time to perform according to that contract, and the contracts actually include penalties when they don't.
Honourable member.
Given that we know the government and industry are facing workforce and supply chain issues because of COVID-19, and given the stated need for this government to focus on the future, so to the Minister of Transportation, will all the workforce and supply chain issues that come with COVID-19, can you share with the House all the steps that you've taken to be ready for flood season and keep our highways open? What measures and what stockpiling have you undertaken to be ready for the spring thaw? Simply put, are we ready for flood season?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, I would say to the honourable member that no one's ever ready for a serious flood season, but we're as ready as we ever have been. Since the 2013 floods, we have done some flood preparation work at berms and one thing and another. The honourable member is probably aware of the SR1 dam that you're trying to get approval for. The previous government wasn't able to get it approved completely. I don't blame them for that. It just takes a certain amount of time. We are continuing along with that, and I think we're as ready as the government's ever been for a flood season.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 affects all of us. Every community is preparing for the arrival of this devastating illness. COVID-19 response is equally at the front of mind throughout Indigenous communities. In these small and often isolated communities, facing the threat of a deadly pandemic brings its own challenges. To the Minister of Indigenous Relations, what preparations are being made in First Nations and Métis communities to protect them from COVID-19?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. Our government has been in constant communication with Indigenous communities across the province, and we continue to develop pandemic response plans and necessary actions to respond to the COVID-19 health crisis in collaboration with Indigenous leaders. the Ministry of Health, Alberta Health Services, Indigenous Services Canada, the First Nation and Inuit Health Branch, and the Provincial Operations Centre to develop an appropriate response as the crisis continues to develop. Indigenous leaders have expressed many concerns, such as access to protective equipment and medical supplies, food security, challenges in spacing in regards to self-isolation, and these are just a few, just to name.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given that Indigenous communities want to support vulnerable members throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and given that our government recognizes the critical role of civil society in supporting vulnerable communities in the frontline COVID-19 response, and given that there are many organizations with a mandate to support vulnerable Indigenous Albertans, to the same Minister, will Indigenous communities and organizations have equal eligibility for emergency social services funding?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you again for the question. Indigenous peoples are eligible to benefit from the over $7.7 billion that we've announced to date, including the emergency isolation support and support for businesses through various tax deferrals and loan relief programs. The province, through our community services and social services, has announced $30 million in funding for homeless shelters and women's emergency shelters. And as Indigenous people are overrepresented in the homeless population, this funding will help to address the concerns around health and safety of Indigenous people.
Member.
Thank you to the Minister for his answer. Given that the threat of the COVID-19 has spurred innovation in communities province-wide, and given that each community is working hard to find unique ways to appropriately respond to the COVID-19, can the Minister of Indigenous Relations please share with this House examples of the steps that Indigenous communities are taking to respond to this public health crisis?
Minister.
Again, Indigenous communities are taking great steps in protecting their communities and being proactive in responding to this health crisis. The Stoney Tribal Administration, for example, has set up an on-site command and control system to manage emergency incidences, and their main focus is to get accurate information out to their members. I'm encouraged by the strong and level-headed Indigenous leadership in Alberta and committed to working together to protect the health of Albertans.
Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so thankful for the heroes in the charitable sector, including staff and volunteers who are working on the front lines of this fight. Every aspect of society has been affected by this pandemic, and organizations that provide shelter, supplies, and guidance for the most vulnerable are seeing increased demand. This is placing additional pressures on organizations that must adhere to strict public health regulations in order to protect the safety of those they serve. There was $60 million announced to support this response. I'm wondering if the Minister of Community and Social Services can share when organizations can expect to receive this emergency funding.
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that question. Civil society organizations are in direct contact with their communities. They know their needs and often are in the best position to respond, and we have seen that in real time with the way homeless shelters and serving agencies have responded. This pandemic is the greatest challenge we have seen in generations. Many Albertans are struggling and their needs are greater than ever. That is why we moved quickly to put $60 million in social services funding in place, including $30 million for community-based organizations providing direct support to Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her efforts. Given that housing the homeless in our province has been a priority, that needs to continue to be a priority throughout this pandemic, and given that many people experiencing homelessness can be particularly vulnerable to the COVID-19 due to underlying conditions in close proximity to others, and given that typical shelter conditions do not maintain that same physical distancing protocols that are necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19. To the same Minister, what is our government doing to help community organizations that provide shelter and housing for the homeless to maintain compliance with public health recommendations?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, we know people are struggling with homelessness and that they're particularly at risk due to this pandemic, and we need to be doing everything we can to ensure their immediate safety. From the beginning of this public health emergency, our government has acted aggressively, providing $25 million to homeless shelters. Organizations are using these emergency dollars to increase shelter capacity, meet physical distancing guidelines, support rapid rehousing, and address additional needs as they emerge. We're working with the Chief Medical Officer of Health and her team, and I can confirm all shelters are in compliance with public health guidelines.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the Minister for heart and passion for vulnerable people in our community. Given that some Albertans do not have a healthy home environment in which they can safely self-isolate, and given that experts have recognized that domestic violence will likely increase significantly during this time of crisis and a period of staying at home and practicing social distancing, and given that Albertans experiencing violence need somewhere to turn to in a very difficult time. And again, to the same Minister of Social Services, what resources are available for Albertans who are experiencing family violence during this difficult time?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Thank you very much for asking that question. It's a very important question. I am deeply concerned about the well-being of families facing domestic violence, and we are taking steps to ensure their health and safety. As Albertans endure extreme financial and emotional distress with the rhythms of their lives being disrupted due to this pandemic, we know that these supports are more important now than ever. That's why we are providing women's emergency shelters $5 million in emergency social services funding, and shelters will be able to hire temporary staff and address physical distancing.
Honourable members, that concludes the time allotted for oral question period. In 30 seconds or less, we will proceed to the remainder of the daily routine.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Honourable members, is there any tablings today? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have with me the requisite number of copies of news release that was issued from Red Deer Public Schools, where they talk about how distressed they were with the announcement made by the Minister of Education and their local MLA.
Other tablings? Seeing none, the clerk.
Tablings to the clerk. I wish to advise the Assembly that the following documents were deposited with the Office of the Clerk. On behalf of Honourable Mr. Wilson, Minister of Indigenous Relations, pursuant to the Métis Settlements Act, Métis Settlements Appeal Tribunal 2019 Annual Report. On behalf of Honourable Mr. Panda, Minister of Infrastructure, responses to questions raised by Ms. Hoffman, Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora, on March 17, 2020, Ministry of Infrastructure 2020-21 main estimates debate. On behalf of Honourable Mr. Schweitzer, Minister of Justice and Solicitor General, responses to questions raised by Ms. Ganley, Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View, on March 4th, 2020, Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General 2020-21 main estimates debate.
Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour. Prior to proceeding to orders of the day, I would like to remind the Assembly that pursuant to the notice received by the Speaker on April 1st, 2020 from the Government House Leader and pursuant to Government Motion 10, the Assembly may sit beyond 4:30 p.m. today. Orders du jour.
Committee of the Whole.
Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act 2020. We are on Amendment A1. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre rising.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to rise again and speak to what I think is a very important amendment. Well, 3 amendments within one that we brought forward to Bill 10 as the official opposition. Now, I'm looking at my inbox for my constituency, and it's clear to me that this is a bill that is of interest to Albertans. I have received over 70 emails to my office concerning this bill in the last 24 hours. And indeed, I would say this bill is perhaps the weightiest of those that we have come back in these extraordinary circumstances under exceptional orders to consider. And I recognize that indeed we are operating in difficult times, and so the business in this assembly in this past week has been moving at lightning speed. And our caucus is acutely aware that the resources are stretched thin, that our traditional due diligence that we give to legislation at this time is simply not possible in the traditional fashion. So therefore, in some respects, we're relying on the good faith of government to honestly and to the best of their ability provide the most accurate information possible to this Assembly about the legislation that we are considering here today. Information, Madam Chair, that it is essential, it must be absent of any kind of political spin. Simply put, there is no place at this time for the traditional give and take when it comes to debating legislation. We must be, during this pandemic, honest with each other. If we are going to be effective on behalf of Albertans, we need to have fair dealing between both sides of this House. We must be, during this pandemic, honest with each other. Facts matter, and indeed, legislation like this, Madam Chair, absolutely matters. And so while the government is obviously working at lightning speed, so is our caucus. Legislative Council, the table officers, and indeed many Albertans like the over 70 that emailed me who are pitching in to provide additional insight, advice, and analysis. And so let me just take a moment to thank all of those Albertans, many of whom are social distancing and working from home, who have been helping us as the official opposition to respond to this emergency legislation that's before the Assembly. With the support of many and with the particular aid of some of the finest legal minds in our province, we brought forward this amendment package to this legislation. So let me just briefly recap in plain language what we're asking the government to consider. First, a sunset clause on all ministerial orders brought forward during this pandemic. So if approved, these orders, which have sweeping force and effect, will be terminated on July 1st, 2020. If in the government's view they need to keep those orders going, they can of course reconvene the House for an extension. We would be happy to meet them here to discuss that. In the view of the official opposition, in a democratic society, we cannot simply allow those orders to be enforced and in effect at a time to be simply determined by the government. Second, we're putting forward an amendment that compels the government to publish their ministerial orders on the COVID-19 website. I think with the sweeping powers that are given to government during a pandemic, I can't think of anything more important than compelling the government to actually publish all of those new laws and the rationale for them publicly. And third, we're amending this bill to give the government sweeping powers, indeed, but reasonable powers to manage this pandemic. I hope it wasn't by design, but we've worked hard with Parliamentary Council and Caucus and some of the finest legal minds in the province who all believe that the powers as currently listed in this bill go way too far. And indeed, Madam Chair, that is the greatest fear in the emails that I am receiving from everyday Albertans, is that government might go too far in appropriating power for itself. Right now, ministers already have the authority to suspend laws. They have the power to modify laws, and they can do this without the consent of the legislature. These are the powers that currently exist in this legislation. The new powers that the government is asking for is the ability to write entirely new laws and have them supersede other laws. Most importantly, the only standard here on whether the new law is appropriate is the exclusive judgment of the responsible minister. That individual, with the stroke of their own pen and without any consultation, to be clear, Madam Chair, without the consultation of the legislature, their officials, their caucus, or any other experts, they have that power to write an entirely new law that could override every other law in the province of Alberta. So we've brought forward these amendments. Now, yesterday, the Deputy Government House Leader rose to respond to our amendment. And indeed, he said a few things which, in the view of the official opposition and in consultation with parliamentary counsel and legal experts, does not reflect what this amendment actually does. Now, I want to be crystal clear. I do not believe, and I would not suggest that the Honourable Deputy House Leader was misleading the House. And, you know, I think we're moving quickly, perhaps in some respects too quickly. And I don't want this Assembly to make a misinformed judgment based on any misunderstanding of what we are actually trying to do. During this pandemic, and now more than ever, we need to be crystal clear with ourselves and with the public, with the legislation and the powers that we are granting to government, exceptional powers being granted to government. So let me respond to each of the claims that were made by the Honourable Deputy House Leader. I'll paraphrase here, but his first argument basically had to do with disclosure, and the Deputy House Leader basically noted that right now the government is already publishing orders on the government website. And you know what? That is absolutely true. Nobody disputes that. Nobody thinks otherwise. The issue is that the government is not compelled to do any disclosure. So certainly I appreciate the voluntary decision of the government to post those, but I think given the extreme powers being given to government, we think that disclosure should be enshrined in law for this government and for any future government. I think it would be an abrogation of this legislature's responsibility not to compel this government or any future government to publicly disclose any changes to laws when it cannot do its own job to question and compel information from the minister. The second claim by the Government House Leader was that the sunset clause is already in effect and therefore this amendment doesn't really do anything. Let me be clear, that could not be further from the legislative truth. Now, given the comments of the Deputy House Leader, we can only infer that he was perhaps talking about the order which establishes the public health emergency. If that was the case, he was correct. So the overarching order that establishes the public health emergency, indeed, but that's irrelevant to our amendment, because our amendment is putting a sunset clause on all orders issued under the broader public health emergency order to ensure that they are also time limited. So to be clear, there is currently a sunset clause for the larger order. We're simply proposing that there also be a sunset clause then for all of the other orders which government may put in place underneath it. Now, that is not a distinction without a difference. This is fundamental to our democracy. This amendment ensures that the legislature and not the government ultimately has authority over the laws that govern the people of Alberta and our society. And that's fundamentally important because of this last point. Because finally, the Deputy House Leader repeated that the legislation simply gives powers to the minister that would allow them to modify or suspend laws. To be clear, ministers already have that power under the current legislation. So if that was all that wished to be accomplished, then nothing would need to be changed and we would not be debating that change here in the legislature now. What this proposal by the government does, their Amendment Act, it adds another, and I should point out, universal power to ministers, to any minister within the government, the ability to write their own new laws and have those laws supersede other laws. In the view of experts, again, parliamentary counsel, who we depend on for the functioning of this legislature and the protection of our democracy here in the province of Alberta, parliamentary counsel and some of the finest legal minds in Alberta, in their view, these are draconian powers that are entirely not justifiable under any circumstances. And precisely the kinds of powers that these over 70 Albertans in the last 24 hours have written to me and asked me and my colleagues to ensure government is not trying to take for itself. I can also offer to this House that in our technical briefing on Bill 10, we asked officials whether this new legislation was charter-proof. We asked whether this legislation followed the best advice of officials. And while the officials we spoke with could not and would not answer the question based on solicitor-client privilege, we were able to ask the client, that being the minister's office, who was the client who solicited that legal advice, whether in their view this legislation was charter-proof, whether it complies with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada, and whether this legislation follows the best advice of officials. Now, when we asked that question on the phone call, at first, they refused to answer. Now, let me say, that is exceedingly rare. Speaking with staff that we work with who have been part of many, many briefings, that was the first time they had ever experienced a representative refusing to answer during a technical briefing. Now, in fairness, the minister's office did offer to follow up in writing and provide us a response, and we did receive that response, the official opposition, about 4 hours later. But to be clear, what we received was a response and not an answer. On behalf of the minister, all that they would tell us was that the minister had received legal advice. So the minister's direct political representatives would not say whether they followed that advice, and they refused to answer whether they even believe that this legislation, their legislation, which they are asking us to pass in this legislature, is actually in line, in compliance with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is beyond disconcerting to me and all of my colleagues when the minister's office won't tell the official opposition that they have faith, that they believe they are bringing forward a law that is in line with the Charter. It is troubling when they will not give that guarantee. So here we are today. All we have to rely on in this extraordinary session of the legislature, these rushed circumstances, which we as the official opposition have been cooperative and collaborative in allowing. All that we have to rely on is the knowledge retained in our caucus, the superb advice of parliamentary counsel, and the honest and best faith efforts of some of the finest legal minds in the province who took time out of their schedules on short notice to offer to pitch in. Now, in no uncertain terms, let's be clear, they all unanimously agree that this legislation goes too far, whether that's by design or simply because maybe everyone is just stretched thin and moving a little too quickly. We as the official opposition are doing our best to protect our traditions, to protect our democracy, to ensure the government has sufficient authority to protect Albertans from a health perspective during this pandemic. So my simple ask of the government side is this: carefully read our amendment. Please, carefully consider our amendment. Go back to your senior justice officials. Go back and talk to senior law partners and our most esteemed professors and ask them if the amendments offered by the official opposition are both reasonable and in the public interest. The minister would not give certainty that his law complies with the Charter, but I will tell you this: I am certain that if you go and talk to those experts and ask them if our amendment is reasonable and in the best interests of the province of Alberta, I can tell you with certainty that they will say yes. Let me also ask that the government members give us the benefit of the doubt, that we are indeed here in good faith and that we are bringing forward an honest amendment with integrity to protect our democratic institutions and the underlying principles that define our society, because we need to work together And indeed, if there is any reason that government feels it needs to afford itself such extraordinary powers that Parliamentary Council and the finest legal minds in the province of Alberta all agree is an extraordinary and indeed potential overreach, if there is any reason, then please tell us what it is you need to do. Because frankly, we are here to work together and we need to work together. And we are asking this on behalf of the people of Alberta, fundamental democratic principles that we all stand by, and recognizing the integrity and responsibility we owe to every Albertan we represent. We, in the most honest and most sincere terms, ask for you to support this amendment. Thank you.
Are there any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? Seeing none, I shall call the question on Amendment A1. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. The amendment is defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells.
Is it 15 minutes? Yeah. Let's go for lounge.
division has been called on Bill 10, Amendment A1. All those in favor, please stand.
Ms. Gray, Mr. Fiat, Mr. Shepherd.
Order.
Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Egan, Member Ceci, Mr. Schmidt.
All those opposed, please stand.
Honourable Mr. Copping, Honourable Mrs. Savage, Honourable Ms. LaGrange, Mr. Yassin, Honourable Mr. Nicolaitis, Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Scow, Honourable Mr. Nally, Ms. Goodrich, Mr. Guthrie, Mrs. Lovely, Mr. Reid, Ms. Isaac, Mrs. Allard, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Toole, Mr. Turton, Mr. Williams, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Yao,
Madam Chair, total for the amendment 7, total against 20.
Honourable members, that amendment has been defeated. We are now back on the main Bill 10 bill. I'm wondering if there's any members wishing to speak? Sorry, are you ready for the question? You're ready for the question. On Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act 2020, on the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Any opposed? There we go. On title and preamble, are you agreed? Any opposed? Share of the bill be reported. Are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
I would request to rise and report.
Having heard the motion to rise and report, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. We shall now rise and report. Van Dyken defeated. The Honourable Member for Athabasca, Barhead, Westlock.
Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bill, Bill 10. Madam Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by the Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 10, Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act 2020, Honourable Mr. Shandro.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
I would seek unanimous consent from the House to move to 1-minute bells for the remainder of the day.
Having heard the motion, is anyone opposed to 1-minute bells for the remainder of the day? Please say so now. So ordered. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
I would rise to move the bill be read for third reading. Move third reading.
Okay.
Good enough.
Are there any speakers to the bill? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Third reading. Oh, sorry. I will wait, Chair.
Oh, are you?
Oh.
Would you? If the will of the House is for me to, okay, Edmonton City Centre.
Guys, for any confusion, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak in the final phase of the debate on Bill 3. I want to start by just clarifying one point from my comments on the amendment. In speaking and referring to the counsel that we received from various sources on the particular clause in the bill affording new and extraordinary powers to the government. To be clear, we heard from all sources that we consulted with, the outside legal experts, parliamentary counsel and all, that indeed this was an extraordinary step. and confers extraordinary new powers on the government. All experts were united in referring that to us. However, when I referred to experts that said that those powers were draconian, I should be clear that would not include Parliamentary Counsel, because of course, while they give their expert advice on the ultimate impact and what a bill precisely does, of course, as an impartial body, they would not render a value judgment on that effect. So to be clear, it is not the view of Parliamentary Counsel that this bill in that provision is draconian. But to be clear, they were clear in what the effect of this is, in that it does indeed confer brand new, sweeping, and extraordinary powers on the government. With that, speaking again more generally to the bill, I think we've been clear, Madam Speaker, that we are not here as the official opposition to be obstructionist. We are here to participate in the debate on what this government has told us are significant pieces of legislation, significant enough that we would overlook the protocols and set aside and indeed use extraordinary powers to go against the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Health in being here in this assembly and transporting ourselves across the province during a time when we are asking people to remain in their homes and not to travel. We acceded to this debate and to that choice because we want to do their due diligence on the part of the democracy for the part of Alberta, and because the government assured us that the legislation we would be debating is essential to their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So with this bill, as I've referred to earlier, we have no disagreement with the majority of what this bill does. So indeed, it's putting forward, the fines that we've spoken of. That, to be clear, again, those fines are already in place by ministerial order. So this legislation is not required for those fines to exist, but neither do we dispute their existence. We support those fines. Those are appropriate. Those are an appropriate response to individuals that knowingly and intentionally choose to breach the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Health during a global pandemic and indeed endanger the lives of other Albertans. We support that. Now, there is the section about police officers being able to accompany inspectors, and okay, I believe that is a novel addition in the legislation, and we certainly do not object to that. We think that is fair and reasonable. We have had some discussion around the element of the government being able to take the ability to directly direct peace officers, rather than having to go to the employer of those officers to ask permission. We've had some varied discussion on that, but in general, we're not in opposition to government, again, in a state of public emergency, during a global pandemic, having the ability to take some exceptional steps to ensure we're keeping the peace and protecting the Alberta public. That's reasonable. So we may have some difference of opinion on exactly sort of where to place that line there, but in general, that's not an item of serious concern to us. And indeed, as the official opposition, we feel the government generally had that power already. But as I noted during our amendment, there are three things which we felt would have improved this bill. Well, let's put it this way. There are two things that would have improved this bill. And there is one thing that simply leaves this bill something that we are unable to support. So to be clear, we believe there should be a sunset clause on all of the ministerial orders, not just on the larger overarching order for a public emergency, but that any of the steps that a minister takes, the extraordinary power which they choose to exercise, which is done in the interest of Albertans during a public emergency, that every one of those ministerial orders have a clear end date. That Albertans have that reassurance, and then government has the opportunity, if any of those ministerial orders need to extend past that, to come back to this legislature, just as we as the official opposition have been happy to do this week, and provide that justification. And indeed, if it is in the best interests of Albertans, we would be happy to support that. That's all we're asking there. Secondly, the government has said it already voluntarily is publishing all ministerial orders. There is nothing in the law which compels a government to do so. And let us be clear, Madam Speaker, we are not just talking about this particular government. They are empowering all future governments through this legislation. So if a future government, which lacks the integrity that I'm sure all members of this government feel that they themselves hold, they may choose not to voluntarily publish all of those ministerial orders. I'm sure that is not the intent of this government. I'm sure they have every intent of continuing to voluntarily comply with publishing those ministerial orders. But I think it is in the interest of Albertans to have the assurance that every government will be required to meet that same reasonable standard. So I find it unfortunate that the government doesn't want to choose to make those two simple changes. But in essence, I'd say those two are forgivable. I could probably overlook those two. However, the third and the final, which I have spoken on and I've been clear about, so I won't go on at great length, but I will be clear. This bill, if passed, gives the government of Alberta, gives each and every minister the opportunity not only to modify or adjust an existing law, but to create entirely new laws, laws which do not currently exist in the province of Alberta, and which could supersede laws that went through this legislature, that were debated in the full view of Albertans, held to the highest of account, voted on by this Assembly and put in place by the will of this Assembly on behalf of the people of Alberta, that can be undone based on the subjective judgment of any minister in any government with the stroke of a pen. That is far and beyond what currently exists in the legislation. And to be clear, Madam Speaker, not one member of this government has provided any clear or coherent reason why they need to grant themselves or any future government that power. That is something which concerns me. That is something I think which concerns a great number of Albertans who have already begun to reach out to me, and I think many more will once this bill has passed. And I'm sure I will not be the only member that will hear about this. So it is a choice of each member of this House, and for government members, it's your choice. If you have this much faith in each of your ministers, that you feel they should be afforded that extraordinary power. And frankly, I'll be honest, I do not. And that's not simply because we are on opposite sides of the aisle and because we do not agree on all issues and values. I don't believe any government and any minister, including should we ever have the honor of serving as government again ourselves, should hold that much power. And the choice to take that much power for oneself in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a public emergency, at a time when we are working on, frankly, reduced representation and extraordinary measures within the legislature. I would like to believe, Madam Speaker, that if that is a choice of this government, I certainly hope it is due to a lack of understanding and not of intention. Because we owe far better to ourselves, to the integrity of the honor of the positions we hold, and indeed to the people of Alberta. So I and my colleagues in the official opposition will not be voting in favor of Bill 10. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers to the bill? Seeing none, shall I call the question? All right. The Honourable Minister of Energy has moved on behalf of the Honourable Minister of Health, third reading of Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act 2020. Those in favour of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is so carried. A division has been called. Ring the bells. Honourable members, a division has been called on Bill 10. All those in favour, please stand.
Honourable Mr. Copping, Honourable Mrs. Savage, Honourable Ms. LaGrange, Mr. Yassin, Honourable Mr. Nicolaitis, Mr. Scow, Honourable Mr. Nally, Ms. Goodrich, Mr. Reid, Ms. Isaac, Mr. Tour, Mr. Turton, Mr. Yao, Mr. Van Dyken.
All those opposed, please stand.
Ms. Gray, Mr. Fian, Mr. Shepherd, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Egan, Member Ceci, Mr. Schmidt.
Madam Speaker, total for the motion 14, total against 7.
Honourable members, that is so carried. The
Bill 10, Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act 2020 is now read a third time.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Pursuant to Government Motion 10 sub A sub I move that the Assembly now stand adjourned.
Pursuant to Government Motion 10, agreed to on March 17, 2020, the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader has advised the Assembly now stands adjourned. I don't think so. I'm sorry. We're adjourned.